Okay, this video is going to go over a poster that was recently presented at the IMMERSE Conference slash workshop at the NCSA at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. I'm going to be walking you through this poster and how it connects to a paper that I published about a decade ago, working on the similar idea. And I'd like to work the idea out more theoretically. But for now, I do want to ground it in empirical examples and just kind of a broad overview. So this is the title of the poster, Naturally Supervised Learning, an Outcome of Immersive Environment Interactions. So the idea here is that we have a body and a physiology, and that when we use immersive technologies like virtual reality or mixed reality, we interact with our environment in different ways and so there are all sorts of things you can do in an immersive environment that can make that environment unique. There are all sorts of interactions, and rather than enumerate them, I propose that there's this naturally supervised form of learning that happens. Naturally supervised in that the physiological systems, the psychological systems are working to supervise learning, but doing so with the assistance of an immersive technology. So this goes back to this paper on the archive from 2012. And this is called Naturally Supervised Learning in Manipulable Technologies. So manipulable technologies are technologies that have haptic or a proprioceptive feedback. So one example here is the experimental setup where I had a subject who was using a golf club that was weighted, and so that creates a distorted rotational field. And then they're playing this immersive game on the screen. In this case, it's playing golf, so you're mapping the movement of the golf club to the simulation. The controller for this game is on the golf club. It's mounted to the golf club. And then the rotational weight distortion is also mounted here. And so you can do this in different ways. I just have a very crude mock-up here, but you could build a more professional type of interface to probe some of these behaviors and some of the ways in which you can have natural supervision. Another example is using something called Novant Falcon. And this is something that you can only pick up as sort of a novelty nowadays. But the Novant Falcon was designed as a haptic interface tool. So there's a program that they had with the Novant Falcon that generated balls of different surface types. So it would be like there would be a rubber ball and a metal ball and a ball made of honey. And you push into them with this, I think it's a 6-degree haptic device. And so you're moving in different directions and you're exploring that surface. And there's a certain haptic feedback that you get, so there's a resistance to your movements. And of course, in this case, we also recorded muscle activity in the EMG signal. And that varied across different conditions. But in this poster, I wanted to revisit this. I wanted to maybe propose some theoretical models and maybe some new environments that we can use. So here in the poster, I define natural supervision as physiological systems that can supervise learning, adaptive accommodation, which is any kind of change in the physiology. We have visual accommodation that occurs if you present someone with what they call the prism illusion. So you have them look through a prism and you have them write their name or pick up a cup. And it's different from if they do it without the prism on. So there's an accommodation that happens where if they spend enough time doing it, they can learn a strategy to do it. And this adaptive accommodation, which you see in immersive environments, is a stable substrate for acquisition. Now, the other concept here is I introduced the idea of human-machine symbiosis. But I didn't introduce that concept. That concept goes back to Licklider in the 60s. But I introduced this concept of immersion as human-machine symbiosis. So when we talk about immersion in this definition, or when we refer to immersion or immersive environments, then we're really referring to human-machine symbiosis. So we have this symbiosis, and one way to think about the symbiosis is this isomorphic mapping between the interface and the individual, their body, their physiology. Another way to think about this is that it characterizes the system as sort of this default symbiosis. And when you decouple them selectively, it creates unique opportunities for adaptation. So here's a model of physiological system in humans, and then some cognitive systems, attention and arousal. And those things interact in different ways. You also have the immersive system that you're interfacing with. So it can have an interface. It might have an adaptive intelligence, which poses unique challenges. It can either keep up with the level of isomorphism, or it can decouple it in selective ways. And then system processes which can introduce lag or other things. This is a physiological system model kind of as a first order feedback, closed loop feedback. And so we introduce a couple of parameters. We introduce physiological accommodation. We introduce offloading capacity. We introduce accommodation rate as alpha and acquisition rate as small alpha. And so the difference between accommodation rate and acquisition rate is that acquisition rate is the information that you're getting and encoding in like memories or in learning. Whereas accommodation rate is the rate of sort of an adaptation, or in this case, some sort of facultative adaptation. And so this shows that as physiological accommodation increases, accommodation rate can increase, but acquisition rate remains stable. So physiological accommodation allows you to allows for a greater accommodation rate. There's a feedback there, positive feedback, but acquisition rate remains stable. So it's not only the accommodation does its job in opening up a window, but that doesn't necessarily lead to or it doesn't lead to increases in acquisition. It only makes acquisition stable. In this case, offloading capacity increases. So offloading capacity means that a lot of the accommodation is offloaded to something else. The accommodation rate can increase, but the acquisition rate becomes unstable. So in this case, if you offload that accommodation, if your physiology is not being the thing that's responsible for opening that window, maybe it's some technology, like we saw with that golf club, if that rotational force chamber or that manipulator is taking all the sort of accommodative capacity, then the accommodation rate increases, sure, but the acquisition rate becomes unstable, and so you're not as likely to learn as much. And so the idea here is that physiological accommodation is a thing that at least makes acquisition rate stable, allows you to acquire more, and so forth. So this is a couple of things here. When we talk about accommodation, we're talking about two types of accommodation. You can have adaptive accommodation and maladaptive accommodation. The first one, adaptive accommodation, is accommodation that leads to longer-term learning. So this is in the case of maybe like the physiological adaptation. It opens a window, it stabilizes the acquisition rate, and it allows for longer-term learning and retention of that learning. Whereas maladaptive accommodation is learning that restricts future accommodation capacity. So this is, where this idea of interface, physiological and where the idea of like physiology and the interface and their isometry come into play. So you can have something that's adaptive, you can have something that's maladaptive. You can have, modifications that are beneficial, and you can have modifications that are not beneficial. Or you can have perturbations that appear to be not beneficial at first glance, but then become beneficial as you learn how you incorporate them into your repertoire. And so enhancements in performance are defined as accommodation modifying cognition towards optimal acquisition. So optimal acquisition involves it being stable, but also involves having these sort of having a wider range of things that are experienced. So I don't really lay out here the difference between adaptive and maladaptive and how that works, because that's situational. But just, putting these things out there for future development. So again, when we talk about accommodation, we're going beyond visual accommodation. So accommodation could be visual focusing, which is typically referred to as accommodation in the literature. We might have skeletal muscle plasticity, injuring and healing responses, immune system responses, and multi-generational adaptations. All those things we're kind of couching under accommodation because they operate maybe in similar ways. Although again, this is situational. So all right. So then there are different types of supervision in physiological systems. We have identified three different types of supervision. So when we talk about natural supervision, we're talking about different types of learning or adaptation. And so the first one is procedural learning. So procedural learning is a process that you don't need an immersive environment to experience, but can interface with that immersive environment and the experience of that. So procedural learning, an example of that is learning how to ride a bike. You usually have a tutor which provides instruction and maybe some sort of physical constraint like training wheels. And in that sense, you can learn how to ride a bike, you can learn balance, you can learn all the movements that you need to learn. It's nonverbal, and in fact, it's it's not declarative. So it's definitely sequential, and it definitely gives opportunity to improvise, but not in the way we're used to with declarative learning. Another one is multisensory learning, where we have interactions between different sensory modalities based on how the simulation or illusion is presented. So again, we have an immersive environment or even like some sort of visual illusion or something like that. We gain information from engaging with that multiple senses. And those senses can either help us clarify things or maybe confuse us in new ways. So these are things that, again, you don't need an immersive environment for, but they engage with immersive environments and are very key to some of these things we're talking about. Finally, we have symbiotic accommodation, which is where this is more in the terms of requiring an immersive interface. But this is where when you interact with an immersive interface, these are the kinds of accommodation that occur sort of as a consequence of that. So we want to kind of put those aside and really look at the types of accommodation that result from longer term use. So symbiotic accommodation involves immersive interfaces that enable or disable learning, enabled learning that can be transferred to non-immersive contexts. So, we want to be able to look at the immediate effects of going into an immersive environment, putting on a headset or walking into a cave. And we want to separate those out from some of the things that are more longer term results. So like in-depth interactions, depending on the design of the interface or the design of the experience, and then how those things are transferred to non-immersive contexts. So whatever you learn, say in a flight simulator, can it be transferred to the real world? And a lot of that has to do with how that symbiosis proceeds. Now I'm going to talk about some examples of natural supervision using some multisensory experimental paradigms. And so these are going to be concrete examples of what we might expect from natural supervision. So I showed one or two examples, one of the golf club that's weighted, the other of the Novin Falcon. They both provide experiences that engage sort of haptic feedback and proprioception, but also with visual perception, because you're aligning your haptic and proprioceptive experience with your vision. So your vision very much plays a role in that, but it isn't the only thing that plays a role. And so this is going to be involve visual illusions, but also moving through the environment immersively. And so the more multisensory feedback you have, the more multisensory engagement you have, the more these will modify and create opportunities for accommodation. So this example here, the first one is what we call non-Euclidean worlds or non-Euclidean environments. And so this term is used kind of loosely in like the world of virtual environments, but this is an example of a non-Euclidean world. This is an example of a constant negative curvature in a space where you can explore the world and you're walking through it and you're always experiencing the surface of this world and sort of the way it's shaped in a fundamentally different way than you would if you were walking through a regular room or a regular maze or whatever. And so this image is from Portals to Non-Euclidean Worlds. It's by YouTuber Tahora Rogue. And so they have some videos that are pretty interesting, but there are a number of applications where they've built, available for some popular VR headsets where you can actually navigate non-Euclidean worlds. But putting someone in a first-person perspective in one of these worlds and letting them experience it is going to result in some sort of multisensory calculus. And this shows kind of this in a discrete manner. So this is a model where you see 4 different senses. And you see the inputs to these senses and the outputs of these senses. So each of these senses, this is visual, this is haptic, this is proprioceptive, and this is auditory. So VHPA is this bank of multisensory, it's a multisensory bank. And so you have outputs and you have inputs. The inputs in this case, aren't going to match the outputs. So the idea is that linear motion cues are perceived haptically. And visual cues are this negative curvature, which is experienced outwardly. So you experience the visual negative curvature, and there's no haptic feedback in this case. When you expect linear motion cues, but you don't get them in the visual case. So there's a failure to supervise in terms of the haptic input, but also that you might expect linear motion cues. So for example, if you supplied linear motion cues in a haptic modality and experienced negative curvature in a visual modality, it would still be misaligned. If you get no linear motion cues in the haptic modality, it would still be misaligned relative to the negative curvature of the visual modality. So what we need here is a negative curvature in the haptic modality and negative curvature in the visual modality, but we still don't have something that's aligned with our experience. We may need other senses like proprioception and auditory cues to sort of align those things, or at least to the point where we can learn them easily and distinguish them from a Euclidean world. Now, in this case, we don't have any proprioceptive or auditory cues, so this is another failure to supervise. This 4-channel embodiment model is in a new paper we're calling a primer on Gibsonian information, and that can be found on ResearchGate. Another example is this Doppler effect. So this is from a demo on YouTube, and this just shows that sort of an example of the Doppler effect where you experience different frequency stimuli based on your orientation to a source. And so in this case, we have linear optical flow and linear motion cues, so the visual channel is aligned. But the proprioceptive and auditory channels are not aligned. In both cases, we have a nonlinear pressure gradient, which fails to resolve the frequency shift that we experience. So there's a misalignment, and these models are good at sort of diagnosing some of these differences and some of these discrepancies. It can help us build a model of sort of how multisensory channels can be aligned or what they're doing in terms of supervision. We can also put numbers in here to make this more quantitative. And so for this third example, we have something else here. We don't use the 4-channel embodiment model. We use a different type of dynamical systems model. So what we do is we look at the initial condition and we look at the regulated state. And so after introducing a number of perturbations, we look at the state of recovery. And the idea here is that we can perturb the system in different ways and get to a new regulated state. We can also recover to the initial state. And the idea is that over time, we go from the initial condition to the regulated state. This is something called the allostasis machine, and we have this in a paper from the Emergent Interaction workshop a couple of years ago. If you want to see an example of how this plays out in a real-world experimental setting, you can look at the upper right, and this is a figure from a paper where we have a human on a treadmill, and they're looking at a star field on a cave environment, and they're getting perturbations of that star field and of the walking surface, so they're getting perturbations in both the haptic and the visual modalities. And so this is a basic setup where you can introduce these perturbations. You can start at an initial condition, and the physiology regulates to compensate for these perturbations. But try as it might, sometimes it doesn't remain at the initial state, and it drifts away from that initial state. It may recover, or it may go to a new regulated state. And so this is another paradigm that we can look at where we can look at these kind of effects. Now I want to highlight some of the mechanisms of supervision. So we talked about the different types of supervision and how they might play out in a dynamical system setting, and how they involve both multisensory regulation and more general physiological regulation. But there are also two other types of mechanism that are used sort of in relationship between the physiological system and different modes of change in the dynamical system. The first one of these is switching. And so switching is a perturbation that enables switching between behavioral states. And so this is where you might have an initial state and a regulated state. Regulated state is reached by perturbing the initial state enough to trigger the regulated state, or the regulated state might be an alternate state that you could achieve through perturbing the system or introducing the right kinds of multisensory stimulation. Alternately, it might be some sort of adaptive state that results from the lack of multisensory information and the synchronization of such. The second is resonance. Resonance is a behavioral trajectory that's strategically augmented by sensory signals and stochastic noise. So if you think about the concept of stochastic resonance, we have sort of a behavioral regime. It's a dynamical system, and we induce some sort of stochastic noise. So if you think about that example with the star field and the treadmill is this sort of haptic and proprioceptive feedback, and it operates, almost like a sine wave. The star field likewise is a sine wave. Or the star field can be stochastic noise. It can be some sort of random walk around a mean, and the treadmill can introduce the sine wave around a mean. And so if we get those at the right frequency, or you get these at complementary frequencies, we can induce resonance-based supervision. And so this might be the interaction between visual star fields and postural sway. And with switching, we actually have a different mechanism that we can use, which is the alternation of learning and unlearning in a force field. And there's a whole literature on inducing changes in the nervous system, or inducing adaptations, or inducing some sort of learning by switching between force fields. You experience one force field, and you switch to an alternate force field, and you do this enough times, and you learn both force fields, and you can generalize your behavior. We might have some sort of perturbation. It might either be a switch, which is usually a discrete stimulus, or resonance, which is a continuous stimulus. And those are both considered metastimuli that kick off some accommodation process. So in the case of the perturbation, we might have a star field that varies in a certain way, or a force field that is, beyond the scope of the immediate stimulus. You might be looking at, say, a force field, but that force field you might have this treadmill stimulus, and the treadmill might go forward and then backward, forward and then backward. So you can actually induce different types of perturbations that way as well. It's meta-stimulus because although you have both stimuli and they're giving you the types of feedback you're looking for, they do so in different ways. The learning curve then can be enhanced by adding nonlinear superadditive components. So when you have two or more different sensory streams, you can add them together in different ways. You can also be superadditive about it. The combination of them is greater than they would be in isolation. Next is a mention of the breakdown in symbiotic enabled accommodation. So in this case, we have a closed loop feedback system between arousal and attention. And this was kind of briefly alluded to up at the top. We have arousal and it affects attention. So your arousal state can affect your attentional state. And you have to have this good closed loop feedback, this robust closed loop feedback, this tight coupling to achieve some sort of response that's adaptive, maintains your state. You have an input of sensation and then you have feedback and it provides a response. So in other words, if you have to maintain a moderate rate of arousal, you need a constant input of sensation. It needs to modulate your attentional resources, and you can have feedback from the attentional resource to the level of arousal, and you can maintain the right amount of arousal and the right amount of attention for the task, and it gives a behavioral response. Now, if you break down, say, for example, the closed loop feedback, then the arousal mechanism kind of drifts, and you end up with drifting attention, and your response breaks down. Alternately, if you break both the feed forward from arousal to attention and the feedback from attention to arousal, the response becomes incoherent because attention is decoupled from arousal and from the original sensation. So we can think about this link between attention and arousal in terms of accommodation and acquisition rate. So remember from that figure we saw before, we have accommodation rates and an acquisition rate. We have high levels of arousal and low levels of attention. So we have a high accommodation rate and arousal. We get a low rate of attention. We might have a low rate of arousal and a high rate of attention. We might have optimal rates for each. And so we can have these different combinations. We also have a link between attention and arousal that can collapse due to less or accommodation rate in the arousal mechanism. And so coupled with a low attention, it negates attention arousal feedback. So we can play with these parameters, we can attach them to these models, we can look at the feed forward and feedback components, and we can look at how different cognitive functions are affected. So there are three concluding takeaways. The first is supervisory processes, and we'll use the example of attention, is driven by arousal-driven accommodation. So the goal of maintaining neuroisomorphy the goal of the physiological system is to maintain neuroisomorphy between each. So our physiological system, one way it supervises behavior is by maintaining isomorphy between the physiological system and the thing that's being modulated by the system, the immersive system. The second is that naturally supervised learning can serve to fill in gaps in the action perception loop. So this closed loop feedback in the last example, this can also be an action perception loop. You could have, instead of arousal, action, instead of attention, perception. You could have sensation as the input and response as the output. If you have this closed loop feedback between action and perception, we can break down feedback and break down feed forward processes in the same ways and have the same responses. So naturally supervised learning can improve one of these feed forward or feedback components is broken. It can guide us back to some sort of optimal behavior and optimal coupling within the system. Thirdly and finally, resolution, form, and features of virtual experiences can enable a tighter symbiosis with behavioral outputs. So the features of a virtual experience or that immersive experience can enable a tighter symbiosis and produce a more seamless closed loop feedback experience. And supervision does this in a number of ways.